trained to hunker down in the woods and survive the elements. Imagine hearing that from a local sheriff during a massive manhunt. It's a chilling thought, right? Knowing that a highly trained Green Beret, literally molded by the military to survive the deadliest conditions on Earth, has suddenly turned those exact survival skills against local law enforcement. Well, that's exactly what we're looking at today. Let's dive right in.
Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're taking a really unflinching, impartial look at a deeply tragic and, honestly, incredibly complex issue. We're exploring the intersection of severe combat trauma and the American criminal justice system. Basically, what actually happens when the invisible wounds of war collide with the rigid scales of justice. Through the data we've pulled together, we're going to map out how the system handles the heroes who return home completely changed. So, here's our roadmap for today. We'll start with 1. The Craig Berry tragedy, then move into 2. Invisible wounds of war, 3. The scale of PTSD, 4. Veterans on death row, and finally wrap up with 5. Blind spots in justice.
Starting right off with Section 1, the Craig Berry tragedy. To really understand the gravity of this manhunt, you kind of have to understand the man at the center of it. Craig Berry was a 53-year-old retired Special Forces Green Beret. He spent over 2 decades in the regular Army, serving as both an infantryman and a Special Forces medical sergeant. I mean, we're talking about a guy who survived 4 grueling combat tours in Iraq. He was highly capable, physically fit, an expert diver, just intimately familiar with high-stress, life-or-death scenarios. And his story shows just how fast a seemingly quiet retirement can shatter. On May 1st, a domestic dispute at his home escalated terribly, and Berry actually shot his wife in the neck. Miraculously, she survived and managed to escape. Berry tried to chase her, crashed his truck, and then just vanished into the heavily wooded terrain near the Kentucky border. For almost a week, state and federal SWAT teams hunted for him through deep ravines and severe storms. The whole thing ended on a Wednesday when search teams found his body in the woods. He had taken his own life. It's an absolute tragedy, and it forces us to ask some really tough questions. That brings us to Section 2, Invisible Wounds of War. Zooming out from this specific, heartbreaking incident to the broader picture, we see this profound tension in our society. On the one hand, we have this deep, deep reverence for our military veterans, right? We honor their sacrifices, we applaud them at games. But on the other hand, we have the rigid gavel of the justice system. When a veteran commits a horrific, violent crime, that special respect often just evaporates instantly. The system really struggles to balance holding someone accountable for a terrible crime with the harsh reality of profound combat trauma. At the absolute center of this tension is PTSD. Now, it's totally crucial to note that the medical community formally recognizes post-traumatic stress disorder as a severe, debilitating mental illness. It's triggered by experiencing or witnessing life-threatening events. Exactly the kind of horrors soldiers face in combat zones. It's literally a biological and psychological rewiring, and it can sometimes trigger unpredictable, violent outbreaks in people who are otherwise completely nonviolent. According to the National Alliance on Mental Illness, the symptoms are just exhausting. Veterans can suffer from intrusive flashbacks, basically living a nightmare while wide awake. They experience severe avoidance and emotional numbing, or dissociation, where the world around them just doesn't feel real at all. And perhaps most dangerously for civilian life, hypervigilance. It's this constant hair-trigger state of tension, anger, and being easily startled. And these scars, they can simmer right beneath the surface for decades before manifesting. Moving on to Section 3, the scale of PTSD. To really grasp the so what here, we have to look at the data. A New England Journal of Medicine study on Iraq and Afghanistan veterans found that nearly 84% witnessed the death or serious injury of an American soldier. Over 40% were wounded themselves, and almost a third directly caused the death of an enemy combatant. So, the main takeaway? These aren't just a few isolated bad memories. We're talking about systemic, profound exposure to extreme, life-threatening trauma on a massive scale. The sheer volume is just staggering. Research shows that over 800,000 Vietnam veterans suffered from PTSD and its related impairments following that conflict. 800,000. And tragically, the cycle continues. Over 300,000 veterans returning from Afghanistan and Iraq are currently battling this debilitating disorder. To put that into perspective, that's hundreds of thousands of individuals struggling every single day to integrate their wartime survival instincts back into peaceful civilian communities.
Which leads us into Section 4, Veterans on Death Row.
Now we hit the darkest intersection of this data, how the justice system actually processes traumatized veterans. You might assume that with our modern understanding of PTSD, very few veterans would be facing the ultimate punishment. But estimates indicate that a staggering 10% of current death row inmates in the United States are military veterans.
Let's put a human face on that percentage for a second. That represents approximately 300 veterans who are currently sitting in prison awaiting execution at the hands of the very government they swore their lives to serve and protect.
So how does this actually play out in court? Well, look at the case of Andrew Brandon. He was a decorated Vietnam combat veteran. The VA had actually given him a 100% mental disability rating because of his severe PTSD and bipolar disorder. Yet after he bizarrely killed a police officer following a traffic stop, literally begging the officer to shoot him first, the state of Georgia still sought the death penalty. His military experience and profound illness were barely weighed, clemency was denied, and he actually became the first person executed in the U.S. in 2015.
Or take the case of Courtney Lockhart. He spent 16 months in Ramadi, Iraq, literally one of the deadliest zones of the war. His unit was decimated, and he came back with severe PTSD. He later committed a horrific murder of a college student in Alabama. Now, his jury heard all the facts and unanimously recommended a life sentence instead of death. But get this, the presiding judge overruled the jury's decision and sentenced this traumatized veteran to death anyway, and the Supreme Court declined to intervene.
Finally, Section 5, Blind Spots in Justice. So how does the legal system consistently fail to account for the psychological destruction caused by war? Well, the answer often lies in how trauma is perceived in the courtroom itself. During Andrew Brandon's trial, the prosecution actually said, "Everybody's got a little bit of PTSD." They used that to mock his claims, essentially implying he was just faking it. In capital murder cases, defense attorneys frequently fail to even investigate military trauma, and prosecutors actively belittle these severe, clinically diagnosed wounds of war. And here is the most striking paradox of the whole shebang. Legally speaking, severe mental health issues are supposed to act as mitigating factors, right? Meaning they're reasons to spare a person's life. But in practice, prosecutors sometimes flip the script. They'll use a veteran's honorable military service and specialized combat training as an aggravating factor. They'll argue to the jury that because the veteran was trained by the military to be lethal, they're uniquely dangerous, and therefore, they must be executed. It's wild. The very service that makes them a hero is weaponized in court to secure their death. We've covered a lot of heavy ground in this explainer today, from the tragic final days of Craig Berry in the Tennessee woods to the systemic realities facing the 300 veterans currently on death row. And it leaves us with an incredibly difficult balancing act. Obviously, no one is arguing that horrific crimes should just be ignored. But if we're going to send young men and women into unimaginable trauma for our safety, how should the justice system weigh the battle scars of the veterans who served it? It's a tough question with absolutely no easy answers, but one we definitely need to ask. Thanks for learning with me today.